Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today. Our focus today is very much on the National Health Security Resilience Assessment. It's an important piece of work for DMTC, but also we think for the broader health sector. My name's Harry Baxter. I'm the Head of Government Relations for DMTC Limited. And it's my pleasure to not only welcome you to this webinar, but also to welcome our three panellists. We're really delighted that we've found some time in each of their calendars for today. We're very grateful to them for joining us. The format for this session is pretty simple, which is just as well, given that you've got me as your MC for today. We're going to run through a couple of introductions, then I'll invite each of our panelists in turn to make some brief opening remarks, and then we go to questions. And so if I could encourage you, as in the email that you received, you can type your question into the chat function in the Zoom, which should just be at the bottom of your screen, or in the email that you received, there was even a mobile phone number to send questions to, if that is your preference. Before I begin though, and on behalf of DMTC as the host of this webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work, which in DMTC's case is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And we acknowledge that sovereignty over their land has never been ceded. But as this is a national event, I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to traditional custodians of country right across Australia, to their proud and continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and certainly I would like to extend that to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be joining us for this forum today. As I said, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome three very esteemed panellists for our discussion today. Our first guest is Anne Harris. Anne is the Managing Director of Pfizer Australia and New Zealand, a position she's held since March 2020. Anne brings over 25 years of local and international experience to that role. Her most recent experience leading Pfizer's vaccine business unit for developed Asia positions her well to speak about issues of vaccine supply and access for Australia, which is obviously both very relevant and critical in the context of COVID-19. Anne, welcome. It's fantastic that you've joined us today. Our second guest is Elizabeth De Soma. Liz was appointed as the CEO of Medicines Australia back in 2018. And as many of you would know, Medicines Australia is the peak body representing the innovative medicines industry in Australia. While Liz has the distinction of being the first female to take on that role with Medicines Australia, I think we're all hopeful, confident, and even expectant that she won't be the last. Liz is a dedicated advocate and policy expert for the pharma sector and is well known for her contributions to national policy development. Prior to her appointment as CEO, Liz was Medicines Australia's Director of Policy and Research. She brought decades of experience to that role and to the role she has now, including having worked at the front line as an intensive care nurse, a clinical trials coordinator, and a clinical research associate. So Liz, again, welcome to you and thank you for your time today. Our third guest is Dr. Leigh Farrell. Leigh has over 30 years experience in the biotech and pharma industries and is Head of Health Security Systems Australia a recently formed division of DMTC Limited. Leigh sits as a non-executive director on a number of boards, including Pro Medicus, Auxilia Therapeutics, and ENA Respiratory. He's a member of Medicines Australia's Advisory Council and also a member of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute's Commercialisation Committee. Leigh has a range of industry appointments behind him, including stints at Certara, USA, also at D3 Medicine, Biota Pharmaceuticals, and Johnson & Johnson Research. And Leigh is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and I'm certainly proud to call him both a colleague and a friend. Leigh, welcome to you. Thanks for joining us, and I might hand over to you and invite you to make some brief opening remarks.
Thank you, Harry. And thank you everyone for joining today, and thank to my fellow panellists. So today we're going to be focusing our discussion around the National Health Security Resilience Assessment, which DMTC and my division are leading on behalf of the Commonwealth Government. This was an assessment that was started originally in 2012, and it was focused solely at that time on medical countermeasures. This is an often overused term, but it means therapeutics, vaccines and point-of-care diagnostics in our world, and it's not just related to threats that are of interest to the Defence Department. It's broadly all pharmaceuticals. The assessment was repeated again in 2017, and as a result of those audits, the Medical Countermeasures Initiative was stood up and housed at DMTC, which has been in existence as a company since 2008, and it was principally running programs for the Defence Department in sea, air and land, but it has ISO certified systems and it's security cleared, so it was decided that would house the Medical Countermeasures Initiative. The stakeholder group for that program and my division includes representation from whole of government, so including the Defence Department, I won't go through all the names, but it's the CMO for Health, the Surgeon General for Defence Force, Industry Department, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Home Affairs. As a result of COVID-19, the stakeholder group asked that we bring forward the next assessment and broaden it to include the sectors which you can see on your screen now. So if I'll just walk quickly through those, and then both Anne and Liz are going to highlight the importance of you in the audience completing that. So the survey is extensive. It covers medical countermeasures, which I've just defined, but it also includes medical devices. I've given some examples there, which can be medical monitors, it could be ventilators and so on and so forth. Hazard management, which includes decontamination, and detailed modelling and simulation, not just epidemiological modelling, but health and economic modelling. We're looking at chemical, biological, radiological dispersion models, and then emergency operation decision support tools. And then sensing systems, how do we detect the threats, and personal protective equipment, which is self-explanatory. The results of this assessment, the so-called NHSRA, will be resulting in a report which will be given to government and drive future policy decisions. So one of the things that we've noticed in an interim analysis was that there was a paucity in the numbers of later stage clinical trials, for example, and we'd like to enrich that because I think both Liz and Anne know that there's a lot more activity than is represented currently in the survey. The other area of the survey that's critical is sovereign supply chain resilience. Rather than just saying that word as a jingoistic thing, we've actually unpacked what we mean by that. We've looked at how companies' supply chain was affected during COVID, how they pivoted or adjusted their risk management plans. We've also looked at the diversity of the supply chain, both in terms of the numbers of suppliers, but also the geography of the suppliers. So Harry, I think hopefully I've set the scene there as to the why to complete the National Health Security Resilience Assessment, and offer that my team is very willing and available to help any company in its completion of that survey. So thank you, Harry.
Leigh, thank you very much. And we look forward to perhaps going into a little bit more detail about some of those sectors when we do the Q&A in just a few minutes' time. It's now, as I said before, my very great pleasure to ask Liz De Soma to say a few words. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks, Leigh. Thank you so much for arranging this webinar. Those of you who know me will know that I'm absolutely passionate about this sector, and it's not just the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical companies that bring innovative medicines to Australians, but it's the whole value chain from that early discovery right through to the actual patient bedside. What people don't know is that I am also the daughter of an Army officer, the sister-in-law of an Army officer, and the wife of an Australian SAS counterterrorism expert. So I also have a real passion for the Defence Force link as well. And I think that there should be greater links between investment in Defence Force and investment in our health infrastructure. And I think that that's a role that DMTC actually do play, is that they link the two together. The health of the economy and the health of the Defence Force are inextricably linked. Those of you also know Medicines Australia represents the research-based pharmaceutical industry, and one of our great goals is to ensure that Australia has a system that invests in science, invests in Australians, invests in research, so that we can bring innovative medicines to Australians. And in order to do that, we have to have some capabilities. We employ over 15,000 people, over 30,000 if you include the extended indirect employees. We have a tremendous amount of expertise in bringing clinical trials, in bringing regulation through to the decision making, in bringing medicines through the regulatory system and understanding our regulatory system, and also in managing supply chains. And nothing has shown us more thoroughly during COVID-19 the role that this industry plays in managing the supply chains of critical medicines. So imagine my surprise when Leigh presented the early outcomes of the research to find that Australia has this real lack of experience, according to the data, in phase 3 clinical trials and in regulatory expertise and supply chain expertise. And it was only when we dug a little bit deeper into the data that I realized that pretty much the entire pharmaceutical sector was missing from the data. And I think it's because there was a lack of understanding about what role we play in this kind of audit. So that's why Leigh, Anne and I have got together and decided that we need to educate our colleagues on the role that you play in developing policy in the future, which will realise the outcomes of the whole value chain, from that early research through to the bringing new medicines to patients, either through clinical trials or through our regulatory frameworks. It also helps map our existing strengths so that the Australian government knows where we have expertise and where we have existing strengths, but also they can develop the workforce of the future. And we all see this as an opportunity for our health and economy to grow. So we need to be preparing for the workforce of this future. And it gives us an opportunity to shape the policy settings for this industry so that this industry can be part of the post-COVID economic recovery. That's really my remarks, and I really look forward to a bit of a question and answer, and I'll hand back to you, Harry. Thank you.
Liz, thank you so much. I'd now like to invite Anne to make some opening remarks. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Harry. I think Leigh and Liz have covered so much there, and so all I'm going to comment on here is that I think for all of us, we would say that health security and supply resilience has never been more important, a point of discussion right now, and it would be a terrible shame that the learns that we have through the pandemic don't actually move from our own individual companies to DMTC and to the government, because the government really is, we can see through this, is very interested and clear in wanting to understand what those learns are and to embed them and to improve our pandemic response, but also it will have significant benefits, I believe, in terms of the broader resilience approach going forward. So I think, it would be a huge shame if we don't have a larger voice in being able to explain what we've learned and what we stand for and what our capability is as we move forward. I would say that I would also like to say that DMTC has been a really valued partner to Pfizer. We've been working with them throughout 2021, and we've been exploring a variety of issues around supply chain and pandemic preparedness. So I would strongly encourage everyone to really take a moment to think about completing the National Health Security Resilience Survey. It's to benefit all of us as well as to benefit Australians during times of pandemic and beyond. Well, I will say it's probably, I would imagine it's not that we don't recognise that our learns and our value. It's probably some practical things around. We're probably a little bit tired of surveys. Maybe, it's been a long couple of years, and we recognise that is probably true. But I guess all I can say is that from my team who've completed it, they would back up exactly what Leigh had said, that it is actually quite comprehensive. It covers a number of different areas, which I think are really important for our industry. And as Liz said, particular areas where we really do have expertise, we need to be able to explain that and share it. So I think, we found it highly valuable to partake. It went through a whole range of things, talking about where we import and export medicines and ingredients from, what processes and molecules, etc., do we have at our that we're producing at our manufacturing sites all around the world. Our clinical trial sites, our partnerships, and everything else that we have in place. So it is comprehensive. Don't want to put anyone off, though, from completing the survey. It's something that we have done, and yes, it takes a little bit of time, but we're also very happy to have conversations directly with companies around what worked for us in completing the survey, why we thought it was valuable. And if you've nominated somebody who you think is going to be doing the survey, we're happy to connect and support them through the process as well, because we really do believe that it's going to have some significant benefits. And in its very at a very basic level, it's going to help to educate policymakers about the depth of our medicine's value chain, which probably we would all say is not well understood, and critical that we have that basis in order to improve our preparedness in terms of pandemics as well. So that's all I really wanted to say, Harry.
And thanks very much for that. And thanks to all three of you for keeping to time. Some of my DMTC colleagues could learn something from all three of you, so I'll be sure to mention that to them afterwards. Thank you. We're now going to move to Q&A, and thank you to the people who've already sent through a couple of questions, and I also have a couple of my own. So Leigh, perhaps we'll start with you, and the way we'll run this question and answer session, I think, is that I will direct the questions to one of our panelists, and then invite the other two to add anything to that at the end. I think that's probably the best, most efficient way to use this time. So Leigh, if I could start with you, and noting that we originally had time frames back in the middle of this year, around May and June, to close out bits of the survey so that we could provide interim reports to the government. I wonder if you can just clarify for us when you expect the NHSRA to be finished or to be completed, and perhaps just then a little bit more about what you expect it to tell us.
So I think the important thing to note is that the NHSRA is a living database. In contrast to the two previous surveys that we did, this is now completely done digitally, so we're creating a data lake which will be curated. This is important because what we're seeking to do is, as part of pandemic and national health emergency planning, we need to understand where that capability and expertise is in real time. So this was, the previous survey was used as part of the COVID-19 response, but bear in mind it wasn't, it was completed in 2017. As to when the analysis will be done, we'll be closing that out in the next month or so, with an interim report due in the first quarter of next year. And bearing in mind, this is now, we're going to lock the database for the purpose of the analysis, but it will be an ongoing curated database. So it's essential you get your information in during the next month or so, if possible. Thank you, Harry.
Thanks, Leigh. And just one follow-up question, because it's related, I think, to what you just said.
Yeah.
Some people have asked us, what if they're in a situation where they're largely a company that outsources the kind of capabilities that the NHSRA is asking for information on? Does the parent company reply to the survey, or is it important to pick up on those supply chains and the individual companies that perhaps are subcontractors to them?
Yeah, it all is the answer. So for small biotech companies, we're finding out as part of their supply chains, if they're outsourcing some of those functions, where are they outsourced to, for example? So we need to get a holistic picture of the Australian landscape in totality. So for example, and Anne can answer this herself, Pfizer was contacting people globally to complete their part of the survey.
I think how we approach it, and it is comprehensive, so you probably do need to reach into your own internal stakeholder group, as well as perhaps some of your suppliers to complete it. I think the way that our team did it was actually to have sort of the interview, kind of have that person online and complete it digitally straight away. It was efficient and effective in being able to do that. I think it probably comes back to you, Harry and Leigh, around if you have a company that, if it's mostly outsourced and they probably more the lead, would it be better for them to complete it, just from a simplicity point of view?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. Thanks all for that. Liz, I might come to you with this question, and it's one that I think all three of you touched on earlier, but in very real ways, I think it's true to say that COVID has helped to shape a lot of people's understanding and appreciation of the importance of things like supply chain resilience. And so I wonder if you could just reflect on what that term means to you when you think about it from a health security kind of perspective.
Look, from my experience in the pandemic, one of the most important things that was raised from a government perspective, from the state and territories, from the health authorities, and from the clinicians' perspective was that confidence in uninterrupted supply of medicines. And that if there were going to be interruptions to supply, that there were measures in place to mitigate and prepare for either alternative treatments to be available or for additional supplies to be made. I think there has been in the past a significant lack of understanding about what is required in order to increase production of a particular product in the marketplace, particularly in Australia, where we rely quite extensively on imported molecules. And I remember being in discussions with some of our member companies who said, if you want to increase a product line of one of our small molecules, we need 189 days notice in order to increase production by any substantial amount. And so if you translate that into months, you need 6 months notice just to increase production, let alone produce it and meet all the regulatory requirements and then distribute that medicine to a different market. So in terms of, for me, supply chain resilience is also building in those redundancies so that you can prepare supply chains for any disruptions in advance of those disruptions. But if there are areas where you have to respond rapidly, that you also have measures in place on how to respond rapidly and getting the right people in the room in order to conduct those mitigating measures. From our experience as well, because our companies are naturally competitors in the marketplace, we're also constrained by laws around competition as well, and also our own commercial confidentiality requirements. So there are quite a number of hurdles that we need to prepare for if we are to truly deliver on a resilient and uninterrupted supply chain. I'd just like to reflect one more thing though. I've been involved in the past decade in a couple of other supply chain projects that were really inadequate in really understanding the intricacies and developments in supply chains across the whole pharmaceutical industry. And I think that that is the importance of this particular audit, is that this information will absolutely inform government on how to ensure that they can support the industry as well as the community and therefore the economy in these kind of big disruptive national crises, because they will have all of the information rather than a snapshot of something that is not quite accurate.
I think, Harry, one of the eye-openers for me was speaking to Anne and her team about what supply chain resilience means to Pfizer, both as an importer and an exporter, and learning about pre-existing policy, such as the Trusted Trader program from Border Force to expedite border clearances, and then some of the agile ways that policies were adopted so that suppliers could come in through alternative ports when some cities were in lockdown. So I think the point is we get the data, but as you can see, it also starts conversations. And this is precisely how the conversation with Pfizer started, and unpacked a whole area of other opportunities and issues that hitherto had been not obvious to me anyway.
And given that Leigh's mentioned it, did you want to just take a moment to talk
sure.
about the experience with the Trusted Trader program and some of the things the government are doing in that context?
So I'm sure there's probably a number of people on the call who are partaking in this, but just briefly, it's an Australian Border Force initiative, and it essentially, once you're accredited, it allows you to, support your products more freely, moving in and out of the country. So we found this particularly invaluable. We had done it already, but it became really an important element of responding to the pandemic effectively and efficiently. And whilst it takes a little bit of time to sort of join that program, because you do need to share a lot of, a number of details in terms of your processes, but once you're accredited, it really does mean that you are in a position to work with Border Force to where appropriate to expedite shipments, and it really does save time and money, at a particularly critical time. And as you said, Leigh, you're able to work more closely with them to find solutions to address issues as they come up. And because of the prior accreditation, it makes it far more seamless than if you hadn't. So I thought that is a particularly important element for our supply chain resilience, but it benefits, the day-to-day operations of our business as well. And probably the only other thing I would say is that I know that everyone's talking about Pfizer in terms of the vaccine, and clearly that is an important contribution. But it's probably of note to say really early on, for all of us, our supply chains, the importance of ensuring, as you said, Liz, everyone wanted to be able to ensure that there are essential medicines and vaccines could come in, and there was supply. For us, we are the largest supplier of hospital sterile injectables, and that became really important. Plus, obviously, our broad delivery to the PBS and NIP and National Blood Authority. But that became particularly important because early on the TGA identified 78 medicines that were critical for ICU patients, and 53 of those are medicines that we produce, many of them sole. And so it became a really important part of working not only locally but globally to ensure that we were able to increase supply at that time. And Pfizer went through the same process globally, identified critical medicines that may be needed for the pandemic, and worked to increase our capacity at a supply end. That became quite important. And I know that MA, Pfizer, a number of people were on a medicines shortages working group, which was also really critical in those early days to ensure that we address some of those issues early on, and particularly, to ensure that there wasn't undue stockpiling occurring within the healthcare sector, which would have a significant detriment to patients. So there were a lot of learns that came through that process, which I think, this survey and the continuing dialogue allows us to learn and grow from as we move forward.
And Harry, if I could just add to that, it's important to note that we specifically have a survey in that NHSRA related to the essential medicines supply chain. So that is covered specifically. Thanks, Harry.
Thanks, Leigh. And I might just come back to you with this next question, if that's all right. We certainly in DMTC, we've dealt a lot with defence in the past over many issues, not all of them health and medical related, but dealing with this challenge of preparedness, and if you can put it this way, the difference between a just-in-case approach, which the economic rationalists would tell you is wildly kind of inefficient and wasteful, versus a just-in-time approach, which obviously presents risks in terms of whether those things are going to be available just in time or not. So I wonder if you could perhaps reflect on those two approaches and the tension between them, particularly when it comes to what we're talking about today, which is this particular CBRN context around things like prevention and preparedness, response and recovery.
Thanks, Harry. Yes, it reminds me of a quote from Donald Rumsfeld about the known knowns, the unknown knowns and the unknown unknowns, but I won't go down that line. But what I will say is that a just-in-time approach does not work where you don't have the therapeutic or the vaccine ready to go. And I think what we saw during the COVID response was unprecedented pivoting to stand up vaccine initiatives and deliver vaccines in unprecedented times. But what we would want is to be prepared ahead of that curve. So have a threat probability-based preparedness plan in place, so we're preparing at risk medical countermeasures for future threats. So this is no different than where we've got a cancer or whatever that we're preparing new therapies for. We know through epidemiology where the emerging threats are, and to cross your fingers and pray that it doesn't go off the charts in terms of epidemiology burden is fanciful, and it's actually derelict in public planning duties. Australia did very well, had a very good pandemic preparedness plan, but I think where it needs to be strengthened is preparing ahead of the curve, both for the therapeutics vaccines, but also the other elements of those sectors that I discussed earlier, being PPE, decontamination, advanced modelling and simulation on a by-threat basis. So I think we need to do better. The US has just issued a report in September of this year talking about where they need to build out their capability in terms of science, technology and medicine, and it mirrors exactly what we've been speaking about today. So Australia is plugged heavily into that network, but we need to get going and do something other than paying it lip service.
Liz, I might come to you with this next question, although it comes.
Can I just
Sorry,
build on,
yep.
Can I just build on that last question as well, because yeah, the public-private partnership piece, because I think that we were invited a little bit later than we expected to the inner circle of discussions around the just-in-time, just-in-case. You know, the shortages working group did convene very quickly, but there were a lot of things going on outside of those discussions that we could have benefited from being involved earlier. So I think the public-private partnership is somewhere that could be built on. And I think that that would then highlight that actually there are some very real commercial realities that have to be taken into account when you're thinking about just in case, just in time. And that unless government understands the commercial realities of businesses when they're making those decisions, then they're not going to be prepared to mitigate for them or prepare for them in the future.
And I might come to you with this question, if I can, please. Director General Tedros of the World Health Organization, I think is attributed with this quote. He said, "Complacency is as dangerous as the virus itself." I'm sure that he was talking about public health messaging and about community attitudes, but I wonder if you have a view on whether that sentiment also rings true in an industrial and a supply chain context about complacency and a she'll be right kind of attitude.
I think probably what I would say, you know, if you think about it from an industry point of view and a manufacturing point of view, I think maybe it's been missed a little bit that actually what the industry has is, and the way that we manage our supply chain resilience is actually very, very effective, because it was one of the success stories that the supply chain actually held up very strongly during COVID. So I don't want to underestimate or you know, undervalue that, because I think the whole industry and through the collaboration were able to deliver and maintain supply chains through that. But what I do believe is potentially there is a great deal of, and still a great deal of misunderstanding of how our supply chains work and the complexity of them. And therefore it flows into the conversations we just talked about in terms of just in time, just in case. Because when you think about, so for example, for our vaccine, we have 280 ingredients coming from 86 facilities across 19 countries. Now that's one vaccine. Now if you think about, as I said, we provide other vaccines, ICU products, you know, sterile. The complexity of the supply chain needs to be understood before you can make decisions. And I think if I was to apply the complacency analogy, it would be more that without that understanding, you can be quite misinformed and be making assumptions which could lead you down a very dangerous path on its own or in the pandemic. I mean, I think the whole industry has engaged as proactively and collaboratively with whatever groups to ensure that, you know, Australians got the medicines and vaccines they need. But I think the survey is the start of a much broader conversation. So what I would hope is that the results from the survey turn into specific actions, and one of those needs to be continued and broad dialogue with the industry and with other groups to ensure that we truly understand this, and it's not just that we don't build or take the loans and still build them on assumptions. As Liz said, bringing us into those conversations is absolutely critical. And so I hope that the survey actually, that is the output, better understanding, further discussion, further dialogue, and that has implications in terms of policy.
Thank you, Anne, for that. Leigh, I might come to you with a quick little technical question about the scope of the assessment, if I can.
Sure.
A question from ANSTO, but I think it applies generally to government public funded research agencies. The question is, does the assessment cover national government funded, publicly funded research facilities and capabilities? As an example, it's cited ANSTO's role in the drug discovery pipeline and quality control.
The answer is very definitely yes. So 2 of our major publicly funded research organisations have already completed that. So it's CSIRO completed it on behalf of the entire organisation. Defence Science and Technology Group have completed it as well, and we would definitely encourage ANSTO to complete it for exactly the reason that was mentioned.
Thank you. There is also one other question which, in fact, I can answer, so I'm not going to bother the panellists with that. The question says, we have completed the survey and would like to have a copy of our responses. Is there ways to export a report? And the answer to that question is firmly yes. You can contact us at DMTC. My email address, I think, was on the invite that went out, or my colleague Milan Gandhi. So that's milan.gandhi@dmtc.com.au, and we can arrange that for you. There's also, if you're in the NHSRA portal, there's also an NHSRA admin email address that you can send those types of questions to, and we can provide you with, obviously not other people's responses, but certainly copies of your own response. Liz, if I could come to you with a question from one of our participants. It says, and perhaps this picks up on something that Anne was just referring to. It says, we have observed a number of companies that have now disengaged as they either put their hands up to pivot at the start of the pandemic and were overlooked, or pivoted but have not won contracts and so have now gone back overseas. And the question asks about what is our plan, and I take that to mean perhaps Australia's plan more broadly than DMTC, to re-engage those companies and to address those types of capabilities in building this comprehensive picture that we want to build of what's possible in a pandemic preparedness context.
Thanks, Harry. I think this comes to a number of points that we need to think about. One, which I've put in the chat as a question, is, what kind of policies do we foresee emerging from the audit? And I think it's really a case of what were the lessons that we take out of the fact that there are these companies that pivoted to turn their gin distillery into a hand sanitizer development agency, or their textile industry into a mask making industry that's now gone back overseas. I agree. I think we need to determine what are the policies that will come out of it, which will help us determine which industries need to be prepared for a pivot in the future, and what do we do to encourage them to have that surge capacity, change facility capability to do so, and what are the incentives for them to chop and change their product lines and go back to their original product lines. The audit, I assume, will help us identify where there are gaps, but I think that the re-engagement process will be in the development of the policies that come out of our existing capabilities and identifying our gaps, and in the development of our next pandemic preparedness approach. The thing I would say about the pandemic preparedness plan is having greater transparency of that and engaging more broadly on that would also facilitate our re-engagement with those companies who in good faith pivoted to solve a crisis and now may be left wondering what their role is moving forward. I know it doesn't really answer the question, but I think it's to be answered, and that the audit will contribute to that answer.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Leigh, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do, because one of the things that we were asking specifically in the audit is, did you pivot, and to manufacture what, and what were your experiences during that? But I think it started a conversation exactly to this point. It's all very well to get industry to pivot. That comes at a cost, and industry is going to be asking, is the juice worth the squeeze if there's not a derivative contract? So I think there needs to be a discussion about positioning certain companies to be ready to manufacture in the event of a need for surge, so they're pre-qualified to manufacture, so you don't have this lead time to get them up to a particular certification. So it's in a way thinking about it as an insurance policy. So we're putting in place a call option that the government could trigger in the event of a crisis, but that would come at a cost. But businesses have to keep their lights on and make a profit. They're not there as a public good. So I think we have to be reflective of that and come up with novel ways to incentivise them and also populate our pandemic plan. Thanks, Harry.
Leigh, thanks for that. This next question is a biggie, so I might offer all three of you the opportunity to comment on it, and perhaps just for the sake of taking turns, we'll start with Anne. And there's a lot of activity, obviously, across government at the moment in terms of investments through things like the modern manufacturing initiatives. There's also been central units within government set up to do things like to look at areas of critical technology coordination and supply chain resilience itself. I guess the question is about your level of confidence, perhaps reflecting on this assessment as well, and the contribution it can make to making sure that the health and medical, bio and pharma sectors are key parts of those considerations and not just an afterthought. And do you have any observations on that?
I think that's everyone's hope, because unless our industry has an opportunity to explain what we do, how we do it, we won't, and be given the opportunity to have that seat at the table early, we won't be able to contribute. So yes, the modern manufacturing fund is really important. There are other initiatives will be important, but I really do believe it's the dialogue that is required, because as Leigh mentioned before, you can fill in a form, but it's once you have the conversation about how does that apply in this particular situation or that you don't really connect the dots of what needs to happen as we move forward. So what I would hope as the survey collects a broad information from numerous members in the industry, and I would also say that we had the opportunity within the survey. Yes, there are a number of questions that you fill in, but it is open for you to contribute above and beyond that. If there are things that you feel need to be said that haven't been captured, I think that that's really important, and it does give you that opportunity to be able to explain your perspective and what you believe the government needs to hear. What I would hope is that, following the survey, is that there are a series of engagements and dialogue to unpack this so it feeds into effective and thoughtful policy making, moving forward.
My view on this is it's about clarity of defining the mission space, because doing a survey of infrastructure, understanding what the objective is that we're trying to achieve, I think that's where we get a proper dialogue going. So I think if we said the particular threat of interest, for example, is influenza, what capabilities do we have in that space in Australia and how could we be better prepared? That's a different conversation than saying, what capacity do we have in laboratories to do cell-based culture? To what end is my point. So I think there needs to be more of a higher level definition of mission. And then, as Anne and Liz have said, to get the dialogue going with the appropriate people to get the particular plan in place rather than the generalist scattergun approach.
Liz, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think it is always our hope and goal that there is joined up writing in the government, that there is cross-portfolio collaboration, that they don't work independent of each other. And I'm not always confident that that occurs. But if you think about what we're talking about now, and Leigh mentioned the word infrastructure, we're talking about infrastructure, innovation, science, technology, industry policy, research, education, finance, treasury, health. I mean, we're talking about almost every government portfolio. And if you look at all of them, they're all doing something. Alan Tudge from Education put out a discussion paper on translation. Meanwhile, all the universities are looking at how do they improve translation. MTP Connect is trying to accelerate commercialization. So we're all doing things in different portfolios. We're all trying to achieve the same goal. I really, really hope we can have some joined up conversations in government and get a concise approach to industry policy, to infrastructure policy, to research policy, so that they actually all are heading for the same objective and not working in isolation of each other. And in some cases, doubling up the cost and halving the output.
Thank you for that. Leigh, there's another comment in the chat, which I'll perhaps just read out to you and ask you for a view. It's a bit more of a comment than a question, I think, in some respects. It says, is the survey capturing some of the wonderful real-world data registries for diseases that already exist in Australia, which highlight the real and unmet needs of patients? One example being the multiple myeloma related disease registry from Monash and the Alfred.
Yeah, so there is, in the modelling simulations question, there's open questions there where people can put in information like that about real world evidence, and of course we want to know where those databases are. So that is captured within the survey, and I'd encourage people to respond to that.
Yeah, and perhaps just to follow up on that, Leigh, given DMTC sits at in many respects at the interface between research and industry, we might take this for granted, but can you just talk a bit about how important it is that the NHSRA picks up on the research capabilities as well as the industrial capabilities, and what extent do you think that's been the case already?
Very much so. So the key role of DMTC, and in particular the Health Security Division of DMTC, which I head, our role, we get defined a mission space, let's say from Defence. They need a particular solution. It could be a diagnostic, it could be a therapeutic. And what we do is we're consulting the National Health Security Resilience Assessment to see where that capability lies within Australia, both in industry and within academia. So we will then put together, for example, things like RF requests for proposals or requests for information, and we actively go out and seek people that have completed previous surveys to get them included in future projects. So we're often putting together teams that have never worked together before. But again, the way we work, and I alluded to this before, it's mission-based. So we will get told we want to deliver this solution, put together the team that can do that. And that very much includes the industry and academia. They have key roles, both of them.
It's come time for some closing remarks now. So perhaps if I can go around the grounds and ask Liz and then Anne and then Leigh to just wrap us up for this session. Thanks, Liz. Can I start with you, please?
My only closing remark is I implore everyone in this sector to contribute to the survey. I think this is going to be a critical foundation stone of really important future policy for our health and our economy. Thanks,
Liz. Anne?
Now more than ever, we need to have insight and clarity coming out of the pandemic, and we have an opportunity now to have a broader discussion around what does supply resilience look like? What is the industry's ability, as you said, not just in the manufacturing and supply chain, but clinical trials, research. We have partnerships in these different areas that exist, and often these existing partnerships leads to speed and efficiency as well in times of crisis. So I think there are many areas for our industry, and it's an opportunity for our industry to have a voice and to be heard in policy shaping that will ultimately benefit Australians during whether it's a crisis or beyond. So again, I would say to Liz, we would also implore people to contribute, and we're here to help. If anyone wants to identify somebody who's going to complete it for their group, feel free to drop me a line, and I will put you in touch with Leigh Dabler, who is a public and policy access manager who completed it for us and is really quite the expert in this.
Thanks, Anne. Leigh, any final comments from you, please?
So this is a foundational piece of work, really. As I said, this is a living database, so we can get a snapshot in time to advise on future policies, but moreover, we can see policy impact in time. So please complete the survey, be counted, be part of forming future policy to prepare us better for future health crises. Thank you, Harry.
Thanks again, and can I say on behalf of DMTC, thanks to all three of our panellists, to Liz and to Anne and to Leigh for your time today and for your contributions. And to all the people watching this, thank you for joining us. This session has been recorded and will be made available afterwards as both a transcript and a recording, so you can perhaps forward this to people that you know who couldn't make it today. And please do also stay in touch with the team. As I said, you can contact the DMTC team that's running the assessment, either through me or through Leigh or through the NHSRA portal. You can use any of those options to get in touch with us and have a chat about the best way for you to complete the survey. So again, thank you. Thanks to our panellists. Thanks to everyone who's attended, and good afternoon to you. Thanks.